Welcome, Nicole Perlroth, award-winning cybersecurity author and journalist from the New York Times. Her work includes also film and TV. She is a regular lecturer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and Nicole Perlroth will now talk to Kiersten Todt. I'm very happy to have you both here today.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this tremendous conference today. Nicole, it's great to have you. And first of all, congratulations on the great success of your book, but importantly for the issues that you've brought to the forefront. Your book has certainly catalyzed some important conversations, and I think we could make a conference on all of the issues that you've brought forward. We only have 15 minutes, so we'll do our best. But one of the issues that's been coming up a lot, even just in the discussion this morning from this conference, is about defense and cyber defense. You have a quote in the book from Chris Inglis that talks about a soccer score. And he says, if we were to score cybersecurity the way we score soccer, the tally would be 462 to 456, 20 minutes into the game. Really talking about how we focus on offense. But as we know, and as we've seen with these recent events, the real issue is looking at how we can be stronger from a defensive perspective and what we need to do. And so in looking at this, we talk about deterrence, but it's also about how do we compel our nation state adversaries to change their behavior? What are the consequences that we can put out there that actually deter bad action? And in pivot off of the recent panel, it's more than just cooperation, it's collective action. So we'd just love to get your thoughts on, based on all the research that you've done, what are your thoughts on how we can do better, not just independently, but importantly, with our global partners in collective defense and in really looking at cyber defense?
Thanks, Kiersten, and thanks to everyone at the Munich Security Conference for having me. I know we're short on time, so I'll just start speed talking here to solve the world's cyber problems. So I think what's really critical here is we have to change the incentive models. Where we are right now is in a place where businesses are still very much under the mindset of, I have to get my code to market, I have to get my product out there before the competition and get as much market share as I can, and I will win and I will fix security problems and glitches later. And from an individual perspective, we still see security for the most part as annoying. We don't want to be bothered with multi-factor authentication and software update prompts, et cetera. And then at government, the incentives are still not perfectly aligned. In a lot of cases, governments, particularly over the last 10 years, have sacrificed cybersecurity in the name of national security, whatever that means to them. And in a lot of cases in the United States, that has been counterintelligence operations, maintaining espionage, and also battlefield preparations increasingly as countries see that they want to embed themselves in another country's infrastructure in the event they might have to conduct some kind of hybrid warfare. So we really have to address the incentive models. And I think in terms of collaboration, one of the things is putting pressure on bad actors together in multiple forms. Right now, let's just look at cybercrime and ransomware. There are basically ransomware safe havens in the world, many of them in Eastern Europe and Russia, where they will not arrest or extradite any of the cyber criminals there that are conducting billions of dollars in ransomware attacks on US cities, a police department in DC this week, Honeywell. So what do we do? And I think this is really an area for international cooperation where we could agree not only on sanctions, but perhaps on restricting visas, travel visas, student visas, putting pressure domestically on these countries to actually address their cyber criminal problem, I think could be a big step and a really big opportunity for some international collaboration there.
Do you think there is a space for penalties, for consequences? I know you and I have talked about the fact that we as a nation and then globally with our partners, we often think about how the adversary will respond. Can we get to a point where the adversary worries about how we will respond?
Yes, you and I have talked about this. We're always asking, well, how will Russia respond to sanctions, or if we conduct some sort of unseen cyber response for a Russian cyber attack on our grid. And we really need to get to a place of stop worrying about what Vladimir Putin will think if we respond or retaliate to some of these very aggressive cyber attacks on businesses and the grid, and even Wolf Creek nuclear plants, enterprise networks. So how do we do that? And I think that's really where defense is going to help a lot. If we continue to be in this place where we're still so vulnerable to an attack on electrical utilities, water treatment plants, et cetera, we're never going to get to a place where we don't have to worry about how Vladimir Putin will respond. But I also just think at this point, look at where we are. How have we responded to some of the Russian incursions on our grid, for instance? Well, we have issued sanctions, but also, we broke the story a couple of years ago that we have been making our own loud incursions into the Russian grid. That's US Cyber Command has been doing that over the past few years. So we have enshrined the grid as a legitimate target, essentially, for digitally mutually assured destruction. But if we're going to continue down that path, I think that's really where defense becomes really important, because you do not want to just keep throwing stones out of the glassiest of glass houses. It's really important that we make serious investment into hardening our defenses, particularly at critical infrastructure, and especially if we're going to continue to lay logic bombs in some of our adversaries' infrastructure too.
So earlier today in the conference, Tom Burt from Microsoft talked about the SolarWinds event and the Microsoft Exchange event. And I know something that you've been extremely articulate about is this, the closing of the capabilities gap between our nation state adversaries in the United States. And, there's a concept from terrorism and security that's, if you have intent, but with no capabilities, you're not that destructive, or capabilities without the intent. But when you have both intent and capabilities, it can be very dangerous. So can you talk a little bit to this closing gap of capabilities?
Yeah, so 10 years ago, US national intelligence estimates said Russia was our most sophisticated adversary in cyberspace. China was the more imminent threat because it was attacking our intellectual property left and right with no end in sight. But then there were these other actors like Iran and North Korea that had the intent but lacked the capabilities. And what has happened over the last 10 years is that those actors have caught up. Now, they are still nowhere near where the United States and some of our closest allies are in terms of our offensive capabilities, right? No country has been able to pull off anything close to Stuxnet since that was discovered in 2010. And I really walked away from the research in my book with this very simple conclusion, which is the US is still the world's top cyber superpower. But the thing that we forget is that we are now the most targeted nation state on earth, not just by our adversaries, but by cyber criminals. Countries like Iran might not have our offensive capabilities, but Iran has gone from something of a digital backwater when Stuxnet was discovered in 2010 to now, and this is shocking to me, but last year, research showed it was one of the most prolific adversaries that the United States now faces in cyberspace. And they don't need Stuxnet. They can pull off quite a lot of damage with rudimentary wiping code. So we are now at a place where not only are we the most targeted, but in some ways we are also the most vulnerable because we are so wired up, because we are so virtualized. So this idea that we could continue with our advantage in offense and then that would somehow be a deterrent to these other nation states and that it would take much longer, decades even, for them to catch up, is just no longer the reality. And we have to readjust our risk calculus for where we are now, which is we are vulnerable, we are getting targeted. Yes, we are still ahead, but it is very critical. We're at a serious inflection point where we have to start recalibrating for defense.
And one of the things I know and how you've talked about the vulnerability, and you just mentioned this, is this open economy, that we're so open. And so what is critical as far as infrastructure, those lines have become more and more blurred. And for the last couple of years, I've been thinking through and talking a lot about how, cloud is becoming critical infrastructure. It has become critical infrastructure. I would even assert that social media platforms in some way have become that. But you said something that I thought was pretty disruptive and really makes a ton of sense as we're looking at this, that code is critical infrastructure. Excuse me. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because when we talk about this open economy and you talked about economic incentives, this idea that we don't prioritize security, we prioritize profit over security. Profit isn't bad, but if we're doing it at the cost of security, it's a challenge. So as we look at these private companies that are developing the code for our infrastructure, talk a little bit about code as infrastructure and how we can then assert more secure code in our digital economy, which is global.
Yeah, and it's not even just proprietary code, it's open source code. And the example I always point to is Heartbleed. This was a vulnerability in an open source protocol that was used for security, not just by the FBI, but it was baked into some Pentagon weapon systems. It was used by Amazon. It was used by some of the world's top technology companies. And when someone found a gaping hole that would allow them to use the vulnerability in that protocol to break into those systems and disrupt the security of those systems, we found out it just was being maintained by two guys in the UK that were operating on this shoestring budget of $3,000 while their code was making its way into the Pentagon's weapon systems. So what do we do about that? I do argue that code is now critical infrastructure. And so I think some of the things we have to do is do a survey of what code is making its way into our critical infrastructure. And that's something that the Linux Foundation has actually been doing over the last few years. They've been conducting a census effort to identify code that they believe to be critical infrastructure, so that then we can brainstorm ways to figure out how to fund it, how to secure it, and how to vet the researchers and engineers who are working and maintaining that code, which is also important. But I think we could start with just a bill of materials. When SolarWinds hit, a lot of the victims I spoke to didn't even know they used SolarWinds. And when I dug into the security of SolarWinds, none of our American customers at the Department of Energy or their nuclear labs that used SolarWinds and granted it such tremendous access into their networks knew that code was really being built and maintained in Belarus and overseas, and that there was very little visibility into the secure design of that code, if any. The fact that the password to get into the software update mechanism at one point was SolarWinds 123. So we could start just by taking inventory of what code is in some of our most critical systems in government, in the grid, in our water treatment facilities, and then figuring out how that code is secured and maintained. Do those operators have strong password management protocols in place? Do they use multi-factor authentication? Do they have intrusion detection mitigations in place? And if not, why not? And how do we help fund those basic security standards, either with federal grants or by incentivizing them to get them through tax credits, perhaps? And do we require that they undergo serious penetration tests? Is that something that we do? And then do we consider penalties for some companies that simply have been using unsupported software over the last few years, even as their software makes its way into the grid? Those are all questions I don't have the answer to, but we haven't even been asking those questions over the past few years. And the good news from SolarWinds and Hafnium and the ransomware surge we're seeing right now is the new administration here in the United States, and I think globally, governments have woken up to the fact that these are questions that urgently need answering.
So you're talking a lot about kind of the preparation, the defense before an event. And I think this is really important because in the United States, we've had a dialogue over the last couple of months about data breach notification, about an after action when events happen. And I don't think anyone would question that those things are important. But I was talking recently to a retired general in the Army who said, it's sort of like standing in the ashes of a burned house and saying, well, you had a faulty wire, you should have called 911 in the future. We need to get to that place where we've prevented the fire. And while, again, all of those things that happen after the event are important, we haven't invested enough on that pre-event engagement, whether it's industry, government. You've just put out a lot of great recommendations and thoughts about other actions. Are there other things that you, in all of the research that you've seen, that have been effective, or where we have fallen short globally in that, the phrase left of boom pre-event, where we haven't done enough? And what can we be doing right now with this urgent call to action for that defense and preparation piece?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the United States, where we've really fallen short is kicking out any idea or proposal regarding mandating basic cybersecurity requirements for critical infrastructure companies. That was a bill that was proposed way back in 2012, at the very start of a lot of Russian incursions into the US grid, and when we were catching China hacking into companies that operate our critical infrastructure. And even then, we decided here in the United States, or I should say lobbyists and legislators decided that it would be too burdensome for those companies just to be required to meet basic cybersecurity requirements. And since then, any kind of legislation or proposals that have come down have been in the form of a presidential executive order that really lacks a lot of teeth, that basically just makes best practice recommendations for these companies to meet these standards. And I think at this point now, it is critical, if we're not going to require companies by law or penalize companies by law for not having multi-factor authentication and patching in place and software that they can patch at all, then we have to think about incentives. And that's where I come back to what I was saying earlier about perhaps we consider tax credits for companies that subject themselves to penetration tests by hackers, and show that they do meet, a bare baseline of cybersecurity. And I think there are other things we can do there to fund those programs through federal grants, et cetera.
And I think one of the pieces here too is we often think of solutions lying in technology, but so much of it is human behavior and education and training on strong authentication, software updates, and those pieces. We only have 1 minute left, and so I'll give you 2 questions, and you can choose if to do one or the other, or do both of them quickly. As pivoting more toward a positive perspective, what do you think would be a nation's metric for success in cybersecurity right now? And this may link to the second question in wrapping up. What's the one thing that you learned in the research of your book, This Is How They Tell Us the World Ends, that was particularly surprising or educational?
Oh gosh. Well, I learned so much in the course of the book, and it probably ties into your first question. What I learned from the book, given we have 1 minute here, what I learned from the book is what I said earlier, that offense alone is not going to get us out of this mess. We really need to gain more urgency and awareness about what has been happening in the cyber threat landscape. Unfortunately, much like the pandemic, this is a threat that is invisible until it hits you. And then you feel it and you start asking, why didn't we do anything about this? Where were our masks? Where were our PPE? Where are our ventilators? Well, we haven't had that cataclysmic cyber-induced kinetic attack yet, but we have come very close, probably most notably with the NotPetya attack a few years ago. And we see nation states getting into our grid. We see them holding our hospitals ransom with ransomware. We see the DC Police Department held hostage with ransomware and threatened to pay with threats that they would release informant lists. I mean, this is crazy. And so I think the biggest thing I took away was this is much more urgent than I think the world realizes. And it is not necessary that we wait for that kinetic induced cyber event that causes massive loss of life to do something. We have already seen our intellectual property walk out the door. We've already seen our nuclear plants targeted, and that's not an intellectual property theft. That is a battlefield preparation attack. So my biggest takeaway was don't stop offense. Adversaries need to pay a price. They clearly have not been deterred for the last decade. Nothing we have done in the form of sanctions has deterred Russia from continuing to probe our grid and some of its disinformation activities, which is a whole nother area. So we should be imposing costs, serious costs on Russia for those attacks. But to do that, we really need to make sure that our house isn't so glassy. You know, we really need to shore up our defenses so we can be in a position of strength, and not worry about what Russia will do in terms of attacking U.S. infrastructure and our allies and Ukraine, should we actually retaliate for some of these attacks. And that is probably the biggest takeaway, is defense, defense, defense. And not just pouring money at the problem, but actually smart defense.
Hence the title, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. Nicole Perlroth, award-winning journalist and author, thank you so much for your time, for your insights, and for participating and engaging in this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiersten. Tough questions, but important ones.